meeting has been duly called and notice of the meeting has been given in the time and manner required by law. We're ready now to begin our information items. Dr. Dupree.
Thank you, Mrs. James. As you know, it's budget season in Fort Bend ISD, and so tonight Steve Bassett, our CFO, is going to provide a budget update to help begin moving the process towards budget approval in June. Steve?
Thank you, sir. Ms. James, members of the board, before I jump into the numbers, I do want to talk a little bit about the legislature and what they've been up to. We spoke in depth about some of the various funding bills that were out there. Again, what we're using as our floor for potential revenue is the Senate appropriation bill. There's a lot of discussion. They're in conference committee now, going through these things, and they're also, of course, discussing how they're going to address tax relief, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of agreement on that. Of course, any tax relief that they may come up with could have an impact on our debt service fund. Vouchers continues to be a discussion, but the big news of the day is that Senate Bill 149 was actually signed by the governor. We received some information from TEA today. We weren't surprised by this, though. I actually, talked to Christy earlier in the day, and we feel, we're prepared to work on this. And it was a bill that's actually effective immediately, which is, kind of unusual from an accountability perspective, but that's the way it is. And so I think that we'll be able to accommodate that. Another issue that hopefully won't affect us in the future, but it certainly might. There's going to be we certainly expect some form of opportunity school districts to be passed. Okay, and by that, what I mean is schools that are in low performing over a number of years could actually be taken from a school district and put into a statewide opportunity district. And how that would look, there's a lot of discussion about that and some of the practical aspects of it. And when I was at the Texas School Alliance this past Wednesday, the districts that were there, when we were thinking about it and talking through that, everybody was pretty sure that if and when that happened, there would be another lawsuit. So anyway, who knows? Who knows what will happen in that? But I think we can expect something along those lines. There were over 6,000 bills that were filed this past session, and so today is actually the last day for House committees to pass out of their, if a bill's been in their committee and it doesn't get passed out, it's effectively dead as of midnight tonight. And so today's the first day that you can say a lot of bills will be going by the wayside. But you can see some of the key dates that are going to be happening through the rest of this month. We're really getting down into crunch time in terms of whether or not a bill that's been filed is actually going to become law. And so we are expecting a lot of activity. But again, we're not too far away from June 1st when everything that's not been through the process will effectively die, and then they'll have to wait again till the next session. Okay.
Mr. Bassett, just one question. Has Jimmy Don Aycock's bill been scheduled for a hearing yet?
I am not aware of it being actually scheduled to be in the House. The next step is for it to be scheduled on the House floor. And I do think some of the aspects of it are kind of being discussed on the side in conference committee on the budget side, but
well, did I understand you correctly? If it's not heard by the House by this Thursday night, it's not going to make it?
That's my understanding. That's my understanding, and it's going to take several hours if it hits the House floor, from what I understand.
All right, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Just a quick comment. This is kind of for the board's information. House Bill 2811 is coming up for a House vote. It's the bill that's about the TEACs and the review of TEACs and reduction of TEACs. So we might want to call our legislators about that one, because there's some disagreement about that bill, and so there's some possibility it could get defeated in the House. And it's one that we've been working hard to get pushed in. So.
Anything else before I get into the numbers? Okay. All right, so here are our final budget assumptions for the 15-16 fiscal year. The only item that is new to our discussion is compensation adjustments of approximately $3.5 million. We're going to be discussing those in more depth in future slides. Everything else is something that we've been discussing since we've started our meetings as early as February. This is a new view, and so you'll have to look at the page that you have. I apologize for the small font, but this is one of the things that that we wanted to be able to start looking things at in terms of on a per student basis. And so you can see our general fund budget growing on a per student basis to the tune of 3.75%. The biggest drivers of that is the compensation and staffing, which we have more detail on here in a little bit, and then also the transportation proposal. That's really the big items. You can see some of the other breakout there with what you see is that our estimated state aid, even with some additional state funding, because of our property growth being as significant as it is, that state aid amount is still going down even with new funding on a per student basis. So that's really the message of that. The personnel cost per student going up 2.77%. The operating cost per student, though, I mean, we are reducing that and you know, putting more of our resources into personnel. The overall general operating budget per student from a on a per student basis is 2.2%. All right.
Mr. Bassett, the 74 positions on the previous slide, is that for elementary 46?
Those 70, elementary 46 is included in those.
Okay.
But the vast
Some
majority
additional.
of those, over 30 were for the career and tech. There were other positions, and we have a little bit more detail
Okay.
in a little bit.
Thank you.
But all those were previously approved positions. Okay, so in looking at our general fund and the revenue sources, I mean, you really, you know, take a look at how the spread is widening between the local funding, which is the red line, versus the green line from the state. And so as our property value goes up, the state share, you know, does go down. We're expecting a big drop in that given our large increase in local funding. Of course, that federal amount just, you know, still stays there. It's not too material in comparison. But again, that state amount is including some of that new funding. So just looking at the on a pure dollars basis, this adds in 16-17. So I spoke about this before. What we have to look out for in 16-17, we are expecting to have fewer students. 739 is the number that we're projecting in 16-17, and we're expecting the CPTD in that year to actually be higher, that growth to be higher than our local value growth. Now that number may be different. I mean, obviously we're still waiting on our final numbers from the county for our growth this year, and so how that looks, and we're going to compare it to some of the drops we've had in recent years. We're not going to be expecting growth between 12 and 14% this coming year. Whether or not it'll go down as low as 6.5%, I mean, just not sure yet. But we're going to have to compare that to some of the history that we've had in terms of whenever we've started the decline in value growth. But some of the things that we've been seeing showing that there may not be much of a decline. I mean, there's still been a significant amount of housing. I mean, I know that they're opening up I heard today they're opening up the models in Siena South. You know, so there's just a lot of activity. Okay. All right, so we're going to move into talk about compensation, and I'll turn it over to Kermit for a moment.
Before we begin, I want to bring up Gwen Touche, our Director of Total Rewards, help us through the compensation piece. And also, I probably need to recognize her team because they're so excited about the work they put into it. So could you please stand so the board can see the people that worked on this? What a great team. Hey, so, you know, we've talked about this quite a bit around compensation. If you look back about 2 years ago and you looked at the input we received as far as our compensation recommendations, we really got it from TASB survey and also from some external data from competing districts. And if you look at where we are today and how we've evolved, you know, with our core beliefs and you know, commitments, we've really started building a culture where we wanted to involve people more. So we started with the BCC sometime in December of 2013. We kicked that off to align. Then, you know, our district priority as it relates to bringing in the best talent. You know, we wanted to look at that in our positions where we were struggling with hiring people and retaining the best talent. We wanted to make sure we looked at, you know, what was the market saying and were we competing? However, these discussions were not done in isolation, but with, you know, our principals, our leadership forums, and then also with our budget and compensation committee. We've also included some external consultants. We've asked TASB to come back in and look at our process. And some of the pieces or components of our process, they've actually seen as best practice. So we've kind of moved the needle some from where we were about 18 months ago. Also, we focused on really building capacity within the HR department with training and then also using external consultants to help them understand how to compete and align our compensation strategies so we can communicate effectively to our stakeholders. And we put in here TASB as a tool. Before TASB, we used to rely heavily on TASB with that information, but now we use them more as a consultant to really help us shape the message and the framework for our compensation. And we're continually doing an environmental scan as it relates to us being competitive with our internal market and external districts. So let's move into this next slide. Steve is going to focus really on the salary increase component of it, and then Gwen's going to follow up with equity and market adjustments, reclassifications, and then stipends. So Steve.
Okay, so this is a slide we talked about last month, looking at our scale, moving it up $500. Again, with the goal of smoothing the scale for an even $500 steps throughout. You've seen some of the detail with regard in the memos that were sent on the, and it's in the agenda item itself, how the salary prices, the salary ranges, the increase ranges from 1.6% to 3.4%, overall an average of 2.1%, with the dollar amounts ranging from minimum of $1,000 per teacher to up to 1947 as we smooth the scale out. We anticipate being the district salary leader through year 20. Of course, depending on what happens with other districts, we're already the salary leader in the years higher above that. And we're proposing, if the average for the teachers is a 2.1%, we're proposing a 2% increase of midpoint for non-teaching employees. The total amount for the entire proposal would be $9.2 million on the salary increase. So whenever we were talking last year about our increase, we really focused on improving the salary in these years here, okay, because of the turnover that we had and just some of the data associated with that. And so the board made it clear at that time that we did want to smooth things out, okay, and so our goal was to address, really these areas, and that's where the bulk of the heavy lifting was done. And so, and this is also something we spoke to the BCC about last year and then followed up with them again this year. We showed the BCC the scale in these slides, gathered their feedback, and overall, I mean, it was very well received and very positive. They felt good about administration following up on the commitments that had been made last year. And so, and you can see, we feel good about where we're at here. If we continued, though, just at that 500, because of some of the higher steps up here, then we'd be asking people to take a cut, which is not what we want to do. So we're still going to be higher up here until we can, hopefully in future years, smooth that out completely. Now, again, one of the messages that I got from the BCC, and we'll have to talk about this with regard to how we communicate the salary increase, just to make sure that folks understand that this is our hiring scale. We do have teachers and other folks that have greater than 25 years experience, and they are being paid at amounts higher than this. And we want to make sure they understand that they're also going to be receiving the $1,000 raise, just like the folks, on this end of the scale will be receiving the $1,000 raise. So we need to make sure we message all that out. In terms of how we compare to other districts, we don't have the data on what the other districts are going to be doing, although, I've seen some salary surveys. Most of the other districts and CFOs I've been talking to have been, targeting 2% given the uncertainty. If they do that, given the fact that we were ahead of them in most of the parts of the scale, I anticipate us being ahead of them as well. So we'll have to see. But that's really where we're at from a scale perspective. Any questions on the teacher scale? Okay. You want to go back one? Okay, all right.
As we align with the district's direction of developing a competitive compensation structure, this year, both Human Resources and Business and Finance partnered to implement a streamlined process for our district leaders regarding market and equity adjustments, reclassifications, and stipends. In October of 2014, these two departments conducted a Budget and Compensation 101 session for our district leaders to help provide a foundation of compensation components that help them make some decisions around equity and market adjustments, as well as reclassifications, stipends, and staffing for their areas. District leaders then had a time frame between October and December to submit requests to us for consideration. This year's compensation recommendations are based on 4 drivers. We looked and considered the district leaders' requests that were submitted to us. We also analyzed our HR data, specifically around attrition, vacancy, and compensation compression data. We also listened to feedback from our Fort Bend ISD employees through various forums such as Let's Talk, the BCC, and our monthly HR stakeholder meetings. And our last driver for considerations this year was around items that were not considered last year in 2014-15. So we had some overflow from last year's recommendations that did not make the list. So armed with all this data, we then conducted a comprehensive compensation review. In an effort to be market competitive, we reviewed 17 job families within our police officer support area, our instructional support, our teacher, and office support workforce. Data from our market analysis indicates positions among our instructional support and police workforce were below market value and warrant a salary adjustment. These positions include special education, severe and non-severe aides, counselors, coordinators, college and career advisors, police officers, police sergeants, and police lieutenants. Based on market findings, a recommendation is made this year to change the pay range for the 2015-16 pay structure. If you look in your packet on page 20, specifically, this is new this year. So I want to point out in the pay structure, we are proposing an additional pay grade in the 200 group on page 20 of your packet.
The budget packet.
Oh.
The budget packet.
I'm sorry, the budget packet.
So on page 20, we're proposing an additional pay grade. So the current pay structure ends with 211 pay grade, and we're proposing the additional 212 pay grade. This is in response to the 2012-13 TASB study that indicated there was a need to increase salaries at the executive leader level, and that did take place in the 100 group as well as the 200 group. However, we needed to add the additional pay grade in the 211 to respond to that study. In addition to that, if you then turn to page 25, we are proposing an additional pay grade labeled 501A. This will allow us to place our special ed non-severe aides in the appropriate alignment among 501 and 502. Then if you turn to page 28, since we have single incumbents in our police workforce, our police officer 705 and pay grades 706 and 707, we are recommending a pay range change among those pay grades that are currently existing. All other pay grades in our current pay structure will remain the same. These are the changes that we're recommending for this year. Okay, in terms of stipends, as a result of our comparable benchmark data, we're proposing several stipend changes. The district is proposing to add $1,000 stipend for each special education teacher. In addition, we are proposing that the CTE agriculture stipend that is currently at the $600 range be increased to $1,000 to $2,000. And then other CT student organization stipends are proposed to be added as well. All other stipends in the current stipend roster will remain the same. In terms of the reclassification, we conducted 18 job audits. In the reclassification procedures were followed for 13 IT, business, community relations, and office support positions. A job analysis and audit was conducted for each position. Findings of the classification review indicated a significant change in assigned responsibilities as well as a change in the level and complexity of the nature of work that's being performed. A list of reclassification has been provided to the board for consideration. In terms of the equity adjustments, based on market analysis from the 2012-13 TASB study, numerous positions were moved to different pay structures and scales. The realignment in pay structures adversely affected the incumbents in these positions, creating a negative impact as it relates to internal equity and peer salary comparisons. The prior realignment also caused unequal proportions in relation to the midpoint ratios for incumbents. This year, the Total Rewards team in Human Resources conducted 626 salary calculations to ensure internal equity and reduce salary compression. Positions recommended for adjustment include maintenance and facilities staff, executive assistant ones, clerks, registrar assistants, registrars, bus drivers, custodians, cafeteria specialists and subs, IT personnel, and directors. An equity listing has been submitted for board consideration.
Can I stop you there and
Yes, ma'am.
ask a question real quick? Because I had a question about stipends. And did you direct us to a page number on that? Did I miss it? Or do we
Page
have one?
11 on the same packet.
11, thank you. Went the other way. So, did you say that the recommendation for the increase in stipends and for the reinstatement, I think for special education teachers is what you said, is that based on market studies? And you said a recent TASB study?
It is. For the special education stipend, we benchmarked against 4 other school districts. We had Houston ISD, we looked at Alief, Katy, and Aldine.
Okay. So, I read that the stipend for special ed teachers is being reinstated. Does that mean that they weren't getting one last year and now they're going to be getting one again? Is that how I should interpret that?
When we went through an economic decline,
During the RIF?
yes,
Yeah.
that stipend was removed. And so from that point, we are now reinstating. We're proposing that we reinstate the stipend,
Okay.
which aligns with the market data that we collected.
And then the CTE, I saw what you were proposing or recommending an increase in the, it says the CTE agricultural stipends. Was that in order to get us competitive, and why weren't other stipends increased as well?
That is correct. Currently, we offer a $600 stipend for our ag teachers. Houston ISD is at $1,500.
Okay,
Clear
wow.
Creek ISD, $1,500. Deer Park, $2,400. And Conroe ISD is at $2,400.
So where are we?
We are proposing anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000. So if it's a lead teacher, that would be a $2,000 stipend, and an assistant would be at $1,000.
And were our other CTE subject matter areas competitive, I assume? Is that why we're not recommending an increase in stipend for those areas?
In which other areas?
I mean,
The other
I'm just-
student organizations?
yeah, I'm just assuming that, yeah, that we are not, that there are other areas within CTE that are receiving stipends, and are we competitive with
We are
those? Is that a
currently-
bad assumption?
We are currently not offering a stipend in other areas, but we
Okay.
are proposing that the other student organizations do receive a stipend. And there's another,
Okay.
and so there's a range, and that is detailed.
I saw, and I did see that.
page
so
12.
That's what I wasn't understanding, that we're proposing to now offer that.
Yes.
Okay,
So for those other organizations, we're proposing the lead at 1,000 and then the assistant at 500.
and we're not offering those currently.
We're not
so-
offering those currently.
Okay, okay, thank you, that
You're
clears that up.
So one thing I wanted to point out, that when I discussed the equity adjustments, particularly with our bus drivers, cafeteria specialists, and custodians, there are such a large number of incumbents in those positions that we don't have the resources to pull all of those folders and conduct salary calculations for those groups. So we are proposing to allocate funds to do a mid-year adjustment for those job families and address that midway through the next year, 2015-16, when we are able to conduct those salary calculations for those groups. In terms of the credible years of experience, when TASB came in and did their study in 2012-13, there were changes made, as I mentioned before, and folks were moved from one pay grade to another. But what didn't happen is not everyone received salary adjustments that aligned with their change in pay grade. And so that has resulted in our salary compression that we're experiencing. We have also found that there are some data integrity issues within our PeopleSoft system. So a team on the Total Rewards department will be focused on a credible years of experience project this upcoming school year, and moving into the next 2 school years. It'll be a process that we've detailed in our HR plan. But what that entails is us pulling folders, employee folders, and doing salary calculations as though they're new employees coming into the district. And we have our salary guidelines that we follow so that we can ensure that we have internal equity among each job groups. So we are currently in progress right now of doing that with our special education aides, both non-severe and severe. Again, there's about 500 plus incumbents in both of those groups, so it's taking some time, but we're projected to have that completed by June the 30th. And then our next largest groups would be the bus drivers, custodians, and cafeteria specialists, and then we'll continue to move on until we correct this issue. Those are my recommendations. Do y'all have any questions?
Nice presentation, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Thank you, Ms. Touche.
Okay, so when you think about the compensation recommendations, the summary is you have the salary proposal at 9.2, stipend adjustments we spoke about, with the lion's share of that being in the special ed stipends. Market equity and reclasses 2.6. Total investment is 12.3. Staffing is, again, staffing compensation make up 87.1% of the proposed budget, which again isn't unusual. We are a people business. So, just to recap our staffing, there isn't anything new on this. Overall, the teacher positions being added are 50.5. Teachers for elementary 46 are in there, but of course there were movement from some of the campuses to elementary 46. Other campus professional positions 12.5, which with many of those being elementary 46. A number of campus paraprofessional positions and then also 10 non-campus professional positions. All these were previously approved by the board earlier this spring. As far as one of the things I want to mention is with regard to special ed, we're working really hard to scrub our numbers. The special ed staffing that we will be bringing forward in the future isn't going to be part of the general fund budget. Any of the new positions that we have are going to be IDEA federally funded. We have a fund balance in there that we're going to be using, and we're going to be using that over the next couple of years as we study special ed more. There's a lot of work being done in special ed. Of course, bringing on a new executive director is certainly one of those key points. We're going to be looking as well at the stipend again for the special ed. We have 1,000 for the regular special ed teachers. One of the things we're going to be looking at is a differentiated stipend for those teachers that are in the severe category as well. Looks like the stipends that are out there for the other districts is pretty much just one number. We think something that's differentiated may be more appropriate, but we're going to be looking at that as we go along. At this point, we've identified adding 8 teacher FTEs already through IDEA, and we're going to continue to look at that number.
I do have a question about that. First of all, I appreciate you guys recognizing that perhaps a larger stipend might be appropriate for those that deal with severe and profound. So I want to thank you guys for that, because that's a tough job. So when do you expect to bring to us the special education recommendations?
They were working on that the entire day for 4 days to try to refine some data last week, and we anticipate that we'll be able to give you an update on that in the Friday update.
Coming Friday?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, it will be an informational item, adding teachers, on the IDA funding. The board isn't required to adopt that budget, like it is on the general fund, but obviously when we have, positions like that, we certainly want to inform the board.
Just one comment I would make on that, and you guys, I've sent emails on this, so you already know it, is I just want us to be mindful of what our campuses need in terms of special educators. I know we're crunching numbers, and I've said this before, that I disagree with a lot of what TEA says we need, and there are a lot of reasons for that, not the least of which is that, it's an ARD committee or an IEP committee decision to determine a child's placement, and staffing is directly related to that. And it's something personal that I've dealt with my own daughter, not having enough staffing. In fact, we're in current year right now, not have enough staffing for her to be included in the general education setting. So my only comment would be I would appreciate you guys being mindful of that. And I know I've talked to a lot of principals and teachers from a lot of the schools in the district that have a lot of concerns around special education staffing and feeling that they need more. So,
Kristen, may I comment, please? I talked a little bit about us evolving as an organization, and one thing I think in the past, all the decisions were basically forced on 1 or 2 people to make those decisions, and then we supported those decisions. But as we've evolved, and I mean, if Dr. Hill just talked about it, we're bringing in more people to really look at the process and the system and see what's best case. Because sometimes we make decisions in a silo and it may not benefit the organization. It may benefit this particular situation. But I think now that we're working more collaboratively as a group, we'll come up with better solutions. May not always be the best solution, but now you have more heads around actually thinking through it instead of just people just executing to what 1 or 2 people are saying.
yeah, and I absolutely appreciate that. I mean, it's apparent that that's what you guys are doing, and I'm sure my fellow board members share my view that I think it's excellent that we're pushing towards that more collaborative approach, and I appreciate that.
You received a draft of our strategic plan, our foundation copy, and as you read that, you'll note in that that we talk about several different ways of looking at special education staffing. And it wouldn't be a surprise to this board, and in the name of transparency, I will tell you that the process that we have is not what we want to have henceforth. But we do have to get an executive director on board and work on having a really effective process where we bring principals to the table early on and look at student needs by campus. And I think that's what you're talking about.
And that's absolutely, what I would love to see happen, and I think that that's a great way to approach it. I just want to make sure that in the process of planning that we're not, that kids aren't falling through the cracks, because, I see it happening, like I said, this year with my daughter, and I know next year's gonna, present even more students and she's at Baines Middle School, so I know what's happening there. That just happens to be what I know is happening. And I just want to be mindful that if as we try to develop this strategic plan and we move more towards getting kids where they should be, which is in more of the least restrictive environment, which is the regular environment, that we're staffing and we're providing the support not only that the kids need, but that the teachers need. Because I think a lot of special ed directors and principals feel like that when they're planning, that their hands are tied because they can't push these kids out into the classrooms that they should be in if they don't have the support and the staffing for those classrooms. And I know that that's the strain that they feel. And as we're moving towards that, I just want to make sure these kids don't fall in the cracks, because if you, really, and I've experienced it, if you have 1 year that you're not in that that environment that you need to be in, that's a huge year lost for these kids that don't learn like other kids learn. It's I can't even express to you how tremendous a loss it is, and I know you guys know that. So anyway, thank you.
Okay. All right, changing gears, we're going to talk about non-staff expenditures. Last fall, as we were putting together our initial forecasts, and even while we were thinking that there's a possibility that we could get new funding from the state, our challenge and the challenge that we put forth to E-Team was to try to continue to figure out ways for us to reduce our operating expenditures. The easy thing for us would have been to just say, hey, well, we think we'll get money, let's just roll over everything. But we definitely knew that we wanted to put some of the funding that we could find into other areas, and so we worked pretty hard on our budgets. With that said, there are a couple areas overall where, really only 2 areas where you see an increase. We had to increase $500,000 for fine arts instruments, okay, and that was one of the things that whenever the board made the decision at the end of the 13-14 year to make a large multi-million-dollar investment into instruments, we made the commitment at that time to bring in an ongoing amount to keep those funds up, so that in the future, 20 years from now, 30 years, 40 years from now, whenever that time is, we weren't going to ask for another multi-million. It's something that needs to be kept up with. And so, in spite of adding $500,000, we had an overall decrease in other C&I line items. Athletics, summer school, there were others to the tune of $339,000, so that the net add to C&I, even absorbing that $500,000 to fine arts for instruments, is $161,000. The police, we really couldn't squeeze much there. As a matter of fact, we needed to add because of just the sheer amount of overtime. The overtime amounts and the number of events that these folks have been going to, and the number of officers that have been requested for events has gone up, and so we just needed to recognize that and put a more appropriate amount in there for the budget. So those are the only 2 areas where you see the increase. Technology is having a small increase. Human resources, you see there is flat, but that's even they were actually had a net reduction close to $80,000. They were actually able to absorb the cost of implementing the Gallup software, which will help with the teacher selection. And so, if it went for that additional tool, they actually would have had a reduction. And you can see we also said, you're going to have reductions in business and finance operations. Legal is maintaining its static budget. But our total, in terms of decreasing the operating expenses, for those divisions there, you can see just under 900,000. Again, we're continuing to scrub the budget, and we'll look at these kinds of things every year. If you look at our general fund budget on a per function basis, I mean, there's a lot more detail, and you can see the numbers themselves in the packet that we were looking at earlier when you had the stipends and everything. There's tables in there that show more detail, but it's just graphically showing all of the instructional related budgets there in the green at 62.4%. You can see some of the other areas, the 2.6% for administrative support. That looks good in comparison to our peers, and you can see the other amounts there. Of course, just to remind you, the board does adopt the budget on a per function basis. But the other traditional way of looking at the budget is on an object code basis, and you can see, how our payroll costs, how they compare there. We're proposing a payroll budget of just over $503 million, and you can see the other items there with the total proposed budget will be $580. All right, so rolling up these numbers together, you can see here we're looking at net operating amount of just less than 1% of a deficit, 2.5 million in both the 15-16 and the 16-17 year. We're keeping an eye on 16-17. Obviously, those numbers will change as we continue to learn about our property values. So one of the things that I want to make sure I point out, this 15-16 amount includes a significant one-time amount of just over 2.5 million to absorb some of the transportation costs associated with grandfathering as a result of our feeder pattern changes. And so I want to talk a little bit about fund balance and how it can be used and why we have it.
I'm sorry, Mr. Bassett, could you go back to that last slide?
Sure.
So let me just make sure I understand. Are you saying we've got a $2.4 million one-time hit to the fund balance for this investment?
Right.
And then next year we shouldn't have that hit?
Well, it depends on what we do, and there's some actions we can take, and we're gonna talk a lot more in depth about transportation.
Okay.
But we have some ideas on how to address that in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. But I think with that amount, and you'll see from a fund balance perspective how I expect to address that. Okay, so again, we have. This is only the second budget for several of y'all, and one of the things we need to talk about is just, again, refresh you on fund balance. So the fund balance that we have, again, we have for cash management purposes, working capital. It's also very important from our bond ratings perspective to have a solid fund balance. We're fortunate to have a AA+ rating, which helps us with our interest costs, and so the having a good fund balance and a good policy is very, very important. We need to have a solid fund balance for unforeseen expenditures, disasters, and then unforeseen revenue shortfalls. We'll talk about that more here in a minute. Just ongoing support. The best practices for fund balance, the GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association, recommends no less than 2 months. The TEA rule of thumb used to just say 2 months, but they've tried to quantify it, and just really depending on where you are from a fiscal year perspective, this amount ends up in the close to being 2 months. But again, our fund balance is needed more so. All the districts that do have a June 30th year end, having the higher fund balance is very important because there's not a lot of revenue that comes in July and August. Okay, those are low revenue months. But of course, we still have ongoing expenses in July and August, especially with regard to utilities and such. So our current policy, just to remind the board, in the fiscal policy that was adopted, and just on an ongoing basis, the board adopts the fiscal policy. So the district will strive to maintain unassigned general fund balance equal to the greater of 60 days or 17%. Now again, up to last year, that amount was 90 days, okay, with a higher percentage. Remember, the board made the designation, and I think it's on the next slide. Well, it's a couple slides later, to set aside an amount equal to 1 month to offset potential loss of state revenue. So I'll talk about that again here in a moment. Whenever you look at fund balance, there's different ways to classify the fund balance. So you have non-spendable amounts in your fund balance. The most common one is inventory, and so that's there. You have restricted amounts in fund balance. Now, the restricted amounts aren't common on the general fund side, but for example, on the child nutrition fund, that entire amount is restricted because you could only spend it in child nutrition. On the debt service, that entire amount is restricted. When you talk about the general fund, there isn't the same kind of restriction, but that's just one of the things I wanted to point out. The one that we use commonly here is to commit funds. So these are funds that are constrained to a specific purpose, and there's some funds that the board has committed in the past for various things, and it requires board level approval to commit funds. Some districts, some governmental entities assign amounts. We have in our policies, you've delegated to Dr. Dupree the ability to assign amounts. He hasn't done that. We haven't done that. We've opted more to do things along the committed side. Okay. So I got a couple graphs to show you here. I mean, our total fund balance, is evened out. In 2014, I mean, we had a significant surplus, but we transferred those surplus amounts to the IT Internal Service Fund. And so just keeping that fund balance steady. We did add to the unassigned fund balance this past year. Okay. And so just to remind the board about the prior action that's been taken on the fund balance, in the fiscal policy, the board created the requirement to commit 1 month of operating expenditures as a set aside for potential loss of state revenue. Now again, we're not counting on that now. I mean, we're not. But we don't know what's going to happen in the future. If oil prices seem to be steadying out in the high 50s now, who knows how long that'll go. It could go down again. It could go up. There are many other things that could affect the state's revenue. But it's certainly prudent to set aside a month like this to make sure that we're not in the situation that we were a few years back where we had to RIF many employees. The board also had committed $8.9 million for major maintenance. It was a higher amount in prior years. Some was used in the 13-14 year. And then also there was a $5 million commitment for textbooks. Again, that's all prior. So there's a table, and you really kind of need to look at this table in addition to while you're looking at the fund balance recommendations. You can understand what I'm talking about here. And so really what we're trying to do is just give you a visual of what does this mean to commit funds. Okay, I mean, how does that really work? And so this is a view that I'm hoping you get used to, and we'll be showing it to you each year as we go through the process, with the goal of making sure that we balance things out and that we're maintaining compliance with our targets of months of expenditures in our unassigned fund balance, and then also on the set aside for the revenue. And so again, we have this issue with transportation that we talked about. It's kind of a one-time thing. What we're recommending is to utilize $2.5 million of that commitment for major maintenance by transferring that to transportation. This past year, the general fund did absorb $1.3 million in textbooks expenses, and so we're looking to utilize $1.3 million of that commitment for textbooks. Additionally, because we are expecting the IMA fund revenue to go up this coming year, based on what the legislature has in mind, looking at both of the budgets for both the Senate and the House, they do both have IMA going up in the 25% range. So I'm certainly expecting that. I don't think they're going to be debating that. And so if that's the case, I think we're going to be doing much better in that fund. And so we could see utilizing an additional $1 million of that commitment for transferring that to new schools. And again, new schools. What am I talking about here? We have which one? Madden is opening up this coming year. That's going to be almost fully utilized. We know the Riverstone Sullivan is going to be maybe totally full by the time it opens in 16-17. That's not really what I'm referring to. In the future, 17-18, whenever we open 3 campuses, there's a much greater chance that those campuses don't end up close to 100%. If they're in the 70 to 80% utilized, they're not as efficient. And so I think it's prudent to potentially set aside funds that could be used to offset some of those expenses in 17, 18. So at least that was the plan here when I put this together. Again, we have the commitment for $46.7 million as the set aside for lost of state revenue. So that's equal to the 1 month of expenditure. And then we would be committing $2.5 million of that transportation that we pulled from major maintenance to cover the expense of the grandfather routes. So in terms of, what does that look like? You can see that in your schedule here. We have the prior commitments there, so just so you can see, you have the prior commitments of the 8.9 and the 5 million, total commitments of 13.9 million. And so you could see we'd be using in 14-15, we'd be basically, you can see a transfer of 2.5 million from major maintenance to transportation, and then you have the 2.3 million for textbooks. Again, 1 million of that would go to the new schools. Another 1.3 is again what the general fund did absorb, and then you could see how the transportation amount kind of evens out over those 2 years. So you can see this negative amount for transportation, 2.5, and then that amount being used here. So what you would see is that over the years as we go through this, these kinds of items will even out to zero. And so if we did set aside some amounts here for new schools, then that amount over there would show as a positive with those things evening out. And so it's really a tool to utilize fund balance and to show it in a visual way, such that you can see that we would be maintaining compliance with the board's directive and the policy to be at 2 months of operating expenditures. Okay,
Mr. Bassett, so that's the unassigned fund balance,
Mm-hmm.
and all
The remaining
in
amount at the
with
bottom.
all of our commitments, aren't we at 170 million roughly?
Yes,
Okay, but this is the unassigned only, and that's the 2 months.
exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I know this is a different way of looking at things. We're not asking for approval or anything right now. I mean, but this is a tool that I saw when I was at Northside. They weren't doing it in Northeast or San Antonio, but again, Northside was a district that they'd reached the fund balance levels that they wanted to that they wanted to have, and I mean, you could keep adding, but it's not always necessarily the best thing to be adding to fund balance. So you're looking at ways to appropriately use it, to appropriately set it aside for things. And, again, that set aside of the 1 month is certainly a very good example. So this is a new concept. Be happy to take any questions you have on it.
One last question, Mr. Bassett. The set aside for loss of state revenue, is that separate and apart from the 2 months of operation?
Yes, it is separate and apart.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
And so you see that amount there for the 46.7, and so hopefully in future years we don't see anything on that line. I mean, hopefully we don't see 10 million that we if we had to use it. I mean, but if we had to, that's the way you would actually see it. Okay, you would actually see it there as a positive number. But hopefully that's a number that we are able to keep, as we go through. Okay. Now, with all this being said, I'm actually going to change the recommendation a little bit. We spoke about transportation quite a bit in E-Team today. We had discussions with principals and the Budget Compensation Committee last week regarding our bell schedules and what we could do, to absorb our routes. I think you got tired of all the memos I sent to you over 3 weeks with regard to transportation and some of the issues that we're going to have. Long story short, I think the committees and the principals, everybody's willing to do what they need to do. The consensus from the groups that we've seen is that, and the discussions we've had, in the end, we feel like what's best for kids is potentially do a bell schedule flip, to flip our bell schedules. And you've seen some pros and cons on that. Again, we're not making a decision on that now. And so what we heard loud and clear from the principals and even the BCC was that if you were going to potentially change the bell schedules in 16, 17, that it would not be a good idea to make a change in 15, 16 in the meantime. That was going to be different. to change everything next year, I mean, to move everybody's cheese in that regard, and then to do it again very differently in 16, 17, with very little community input at this point, that was definitely the message that we got. And so anyway, in that regard, I think the additional amount for transportation in this year is going to be closer to $4.5 million. And so what I would propose then is that whatever we were setting aside for new schools, I'd bring up to the transportation amount there. That'd be 4.5. This would probably be 4.5, and what we bring to you on the budget will be another 2.5. I mean, another $2 million up in that row. Okay, and so that's kind of what we're thinking, and we put all these slides together before we had that discussion today in our in E-team.
Mrs. Tosan, or Mr. George, go ahead.
So a couple of questions. So you're saying that the change in the recommendation is going to be to take the 2 million out of new schools and move it up to transportation?
Right, because we don't really have enough elsewhere right now, this late in the game, to
Okay.
add back up to the transportation line.
So how are we going to put back into new schools? Because you're talking about for the 17 year.
Yeah, for the 17, 18
Yeah.
year.
So we have time to do that. We don't have to
Right.
do that now.
What I'm hoping that, 16, 17, and 15, 16 look very different, just depending on what happens in Austin. And so, there's going to be a number of things, as we go along. I am expecting a funding drop because of that change in the property values. Our property values not keeping up with what the state's
Right.
going to be coming up with that next year. And so if we do get a fair amount of new revenue, I don't anticipate us committing any of that to recurring expenses. We'll be potentially bringing to the board in future amendments other things that we could commit to the future with new schools being among that.
Okay. And with regard to the bell changes, the schedule
Mhm.
changes, 'cause $4.5 million's a lot more than I thought it would be, so that's
Mhm.
kind of surprised. I guess if we do nothing. You're saying keeping
Right.
status quo next year.
Keep the status quo. That's what, I'm not excited about that.
Yeah. But we're looking at potentially changing for the 16, 17
Yes,
school
ma'am.
year. And do we plan to engage the community on that? Okay, so that's our plan, is to move forward. And
It is. Excuse me. I've had a lot of conversation because of the timing on just the way everything cycled out this year. We kind of got to the place where we had to make the decision, is it worth the extra $1.5 million to $2 million to not move everyone's cheese this late in the game? Because we know if we announce any change to the bell schedule right now, it'll be a huge community concern. But our plan is to early next fall initiate the discussion with the community and of course with the board, and then so that we would then be able to by November and make known any decisions that are going to be going forward. And the thing is, I don't know, I may be wrong, but I think we'll pay a little more out this year, but if we can accomplish flipping the bell schedule, we'll gain all of that back.
That's what I was going to
In
ask.
the future. It's a very dramatic savings to
Right.
do what we need to do with the bell schedule, but it will take, we may not ever get full community support to do it. We may just have to determine it's worth the savings and have the communication and the engagement about it, but then we'll have to then kind of weigh the pros and the cons and make a decision at some point.
Yeah, that point's well taken. So that was going to be my next question, was whether we were going to gain a lot of that back. So, thank you.
Mr. George, do you have a comment or question?
Yeah, one question I had was, when you mentioned on slide 23, said we used to have 90 days of operating expenditures in unassigned balance, but now we decide to go to 60. And you said it is approved by the board?
Right, in the fiscal policy that was approved by the board last July, we still have 90 days.
Okay,
Okay, but we're saying that 1 month of that is we're going to put a name on it, and we're going to say it's a set aside for potential loss of state revenue.
okay.
Okay.
So still we have that.
We
90.
still, but with that 1 month and then the other 2 unassigned, we
Okay.
still have effectively 3 months.
Okay, and you also mentioned having that balance is also important to maintaining our, the bond
Our
rating.
ratings, our ratings,
Yeah.
that's right. I mean,
Yeah.
that's one of the discussions we'll have with the rating agencies later this month.
Yeah, I prefer, coming from a finance background, we always recommend 90 days for
Sure.
anything. So I was just concerned we are just dropping it down, but you explained it. It is just, we are going to move 1 month into a different name maybe, but it is still there.
Right, and to be frank, part of this is just a strategy that we're maintaining to discourage the state from clawing back fund balance.
Okay,
Okay.
okay. Thank you.
I don't know how else to say it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
That's nicely said. Do you have any questions? Mr. Rice, do you have a question? Okay. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Thank you. Keep missing that opportunity. Well, I'd like to make a comment, first of all, with regard to the bell schedule. I absolutely agree. I do not think we should change the bell schedule for next fall. I think that would be a very bad idea. People have made their plans, they're organizing their daycare, all of those things, and that's really would be an unfortunate change for a lot of families, just to organize their work schedule. So I think it's much wiser to have a community engagement process. That's how we've been doing things. That's consistent with our theme when we're making changes, and I'm much more comfortable with that concept. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. The second thing is, when you talk about $4.5 million, that is I agree with Mrs. Tassan. That is incredibly expensive. And that's like an unintended consequence of something we were trying to do that we thought was good for kids. Gosh, that really is expensive. So I think the creative solution that you have come up with, thinking about a different type of bell schedule that would help us with that expense, and potentially would reduce transportation costs in the long term overall, so that presumably when this grandfathering phase is finished, our overall transportation costs would be reduced, is how I understood you explaining it. Maybe that's a positive unintended consequence of thinking hard and looking hard at a particular issue.
Okay.
The third thing I'd like to say is that the new schools, money set aside for new schools, is an interesting idea. What I heard you saying is that it is intended to make up for operating expense caused by low enrollment at a new school.
Initially.
And I guess what I would push back on that is, I am not that comfortable with building and opening a new school if it's not going to be utilized to an appropriate extent. And I don't know what the break-off numbers for that are, but I would say that in an effort to be fiscally conservative, we need to consider carefully before we're building and opening a new school if it's going to cost us money to do that. So that would be my comment or thought on that. Does anybody have any other comments or questions? All right.
Okay.
Actually, Craig, like
Mr.
totally,
George.
I just wanted to support what you said. I agree with you 100%.
Thank you.
When we
Mr.
are putting 20, 30, 40 million into a school, we want to make sure, we are going to utilize that facility.
Sure.
Whatever the extent we wanted to, or we expect that facility to be used.
Yes, sir.
I hope it makes sense.
Mhm.
I agree with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. George. Mr. Bassett.
Okay. All right. So just to remind the board is required to adopt the budget for child nutrition. We don't see, there's not a lot going on in child nutrition in that year. We see it breaking even. We did have a deficit the prior year, but again, that was to bring us back below the 3-month threshold. That was an audit finding for TEA. You want to be in between 2 months and 3 months. And so we're we're going to be there after this year is over. We're not anticipating any price increases in child nutrition. So anyway, and again, we did do some research with regard to the possibility of opting out of programs and things like that, and it's really not something that's feasible. If we did opt out of the child nutrition program in any of our campuses that have low free and reduced counts, then our comp ed funding on the general fund side would be at risk, and we haven't seen anything new from the legislature that would help us with that. And so, pretty much just status quo for 15-16. Okay. The debt service is a little bit more interesting. We've adding to our fund balance in 14-15. We see potentially pulling a little bit of that back in the current year. In next year as we structure our debt. I'm going to bring Mr. Villasenor up here in a moment. We're going to talk about our potential plan of finance. We just have just a few slides. We don't have 20, just a few slides to talk about our debt service plan to follow up on our last discussion. And so we are going to be looking to structure the debt we're going to be keeping things at 30 pennies and maximizing those 30 pennies. So I'll go ahead and bring a roll up. He can just go right there. Okay, well he'll stand there. He looks regal up there. Okay. All right.
Thank you, Steve. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen of the board, members of the staff, and community members. As we discussed with the board the last time I was here, we are set to issue approximately $100 million of the district's 2014 voter authorization. We do believe that splitting that $100 million into two $50 million VRDO issues will be the best path for the school district at this point, taking advantage of the short end of the yield curve, which will produce some interest rate savings over the next X number of years. We're also providing the tax rate analysis that assumes those factors there, slightly over $28 billion tax base, value growth of approximately 12%, and then 5% after 2016, and then 3% 18 through 22 and 0 thereafter. And we're assuming a 99% collection rate, and we're estimating market rates with respect to the tax rate analysis of April the 27th. Next slide, please.
Quick question before you move on. It says here you're showing a 99% collection rate. I think on another slide, which I have no idea where it is right now, you guys showed that we were actually collecting around 96%. Is that correct?
Yeah, but I mean, it's getting closer. I mean, April is definitely, we're actually ahead of last year, whereas in the March reports that you have, we were behind last year just by a few points. And we're actually ahead. But
96 was kind of a progress report. That's where we are so far.
But I thought I saw that for prior years as well.
That was just the same time of year.
Okay. So do we typically hit 99%?
Yes, ma'am.
That's where, okay, thank you.
Sure.
I have a question on the last slide. I think when last time we talked about the variable rates, we talk about it, and is there any way we can see the savings difference, or how much we are going to save using the variable rates? Because the interest rate historically being the lowest level, right now, and it make me kind of a little uncomfortable. We are dealing with I raised that concern last time also, yeah. And it make me uncomfortable, working with the 1 year term, and at the same time, I'm not against doing that if we see a substantial advantage to do that. And is there anywhere we can see what is the difference, or is that a substantial amount, or I hope you understand what I'm trying to say.
It's coming up on the next slide.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah. So.
Again, based on the information from April 27th, on the top box there, basically what we said is, look, if you decided to issue whether it's one of the series or both or a combination. We've just split them up evenly at this point. Those are the coupon rates that you would expect. We believe that if you went anywhere from 1 to 5 years, the coupon, which is what you pay interest against, would be approximately 2%. We did earlier in February for Round Rock ISD, we're able to push the coupon on the 1 year to 1.5%. The difference there is that you're actually going to sell at a premium, and that's what the market is demanding today. And oftentimes we're hearing, and we hear quite often about how low interest rates are, but we can't find a lot of investors that really want to lend you money at those low interest rates. What we really have had since 08-09 is what we call a premium market, a market that's requiring a higher than market coupon because the buyers are willing to pay you a premium. So even though, as an example, the yield, and I'll just pick the middle one, the 3-year, if we had a more normal market, and I don't even think I know what that is anymore, particularly since 08-09, but if we had a more normal market, the yield on the 3-year would actually be your coupon, and probably something even like a 125. Okay, but lenders aren't willing to lend you money at those rates. Again, because everyone since 08-09 has perceived that interest rates were going to go up. And so folks don't want to get caught, investors don't want to get caught with a coupon, which is the important piece of this analysis here. They don't want to end up with a coupon that would be below market soon after they would have purchased that bond or lent you that money. So what they're willing to do and have been willing to do, I've never seen it to the level that we're seeing it today. And in the 32 years I've been doing this, they're willing to pay you a premium to protect themselves on the upside. Okay, and that's what they're really paying you. If you look at a long-term interest rates, particularly for a fixed rate interest rate, and you would see it very clearly if the board decided to go that route, you really would see not low interest rates on the back end of the borrowing. You would see coupons of 4% and 5%. And people look at those coupons and say, well, gosh, I thought you said interest rates were low. Well, they are, but investors have been unwilling to lend you folks money at those levels. But they've been willing to pay you $1,200 for a $1,000 bond, which creates the premium that you're seeing here. So that's you know, and it's the oddest market I've seen in as long as I've been doing this, but that's where we're at. And so what we're trying to do here, and you can see it, and obviously because we've not sold the bonds, we're estimating some things here, again, based on interest rates that we saw on April 27th. And so if you look at and assume that we split the $100 million up into a Series A and a Series B, okay, we've indicated there for you what we would expect the interest expense to be on those two issues in the first year. And then we also give you on the second from the right column, it says fixed rate issue. We estimated, okay, if we decide to sell a fixed rate 25-year issue, what would the interest expense be on that for $100 million? And we're estimating $4,151,352. The difference between those two is what we expect in reduced interest expense just over the first 2 years. Okay. Now remember that at the end of the first year, we're going to remarket the A series. And as we track this down, we'll be able to provide the board sort of a running total of the benefit of these short-term rates. And again, this represents a small percentage of your total outstanding debt. So we believe that what it does in the long run is it allows you to simply take advantage of short-term rates, not overwhelm the debt portfolio with short-term rates, which would be obviously put the debt portfolio at high risk. So we did this exact same thing for Northeast ISD in 2013. And we are this summer going to remarket the second piece of that. And the negative number on the far right, which is the interest expense, and I hate to use the word savings because when you say savings, people say, okay, where is it? If you saved it, where is it? Well, you're really avoiding that interest expense. Their number is up to $15 million in just 3 years. Now, the other side of this coin is people might say, well, gosh, yeah, but interest rates have been very, very low, and at some point they're going to go up. The reason we broke this up the way we did, And the reason why we suggested a 1 and a 2 year is because it allows us the opportunity to sort of react quickly, as opposed to saying, well, gosh, we really like the 2% coupon with the 191 yield, why don't we do a 5 year? The 5 year, we'd wait 5 years and we would be subject to 5 years of short-term interest rate risk versus 1 or 2 years. That's why we've done it this way.
And also, as you know, there is a cost attached to servicing, the bond.
Right.
And is there anywhere it specifically mentioned what does it look like? And I'm trying to understand. And so, because when you have a 5 year, 10 year, 15 year, whatever the long-term bond, you're not really, I'm talking about a cost attached to short-term bond to refinance it, and, all
To
that.
remarket it.
Yeah.
The fees for remarketings are much reduced from the initial offering here that we'll do in June. So it's not as if you're duplicating expenses, because we're able to offer the school district, and then all the parties to the transactions are able to offer the school district reduced fees, particularly the remarketing fees are much reduced for the full $100 million. And those are taken into account when we calculate this difference in cost. Okay?
Thank you.
Mr. Rosenthal has a question.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. The next slide, please. This is and I'm sorry, this schedule is so busy,
They have the one page in
Okay,
front of them, so
good.
they can see it.
but I got it on this size, so I know I can't see it. But what we try to do in this schedule is provide the board with sort of the full picture of the debt portfolio and how it impacts the tax rate, including what we're proposing that the board do in June, and that is to sell $100 million of new money in $50 million increments. Now, as you can see on the very top and about the middle of the chart here, you don't see 50 million up there, right? And the reason we don't get to 50 million is because of the premium that I've talked about. Because the prospective investors are willing to pay you a premium for that 2% coupon, but on the 1 year, we're going to try to get that down to 1.5. We take that excess premium that we don't use to pay expenses, and we simply reduce the par amount of the issue. Now, we still have to, if that money ends up in the construction fund, it still goes against the voted authority, right? So we can't generate more than the voters authorized, but it allows us to reduce the principal that's outstanding. And that's one of the other sort of unintended consequences and benefits to you folks of the premium structures that we're seeing in the market today, is that you're getting, so in other words, on these two financings, we're going to deposit $100 million in the construction fund, but you will have only issued whatever the sum of those two numbers is. I can't see them from this angle. Okay, so you're actually borrowing $100 million, okay, but your debt portfolio is going to reflect a lesser amount in terms of principal outstanding out of this 2014 authorization. Okay.
So, Raul, is it, whenever we sent the memo to y'all, it included some of the savings from Northeast, and again, what we plan on doing, again, we're certainly not ever going to exceed the board fiscal policy to have too much of our variable rate, too much of our debt in variable rate. But what we hope to be able to do is over time ladder things out over 4 to 5 years so that we have some amount coming currently, and so we're only subject to interest rate risk on a small portion, 1 year at a time. And so, I mean, the goal, and Raul, tell me if this is realistic or not. I mean, the goal through those savings is to potentially have savings on an ongoing basis to the tune of 2 to 3 pennies a year, with 3 pennies being, up to $9 million. And so, I mean, is that?
No, I think that's fair.
Once you ladder that out, and so in between that strategy, and then hopefully, I mean, again, the wild card right now is what's going to happen with the legislature on the homesteads and things like that. We don't know how that's going to look. We don't know how that's going to play out. But if nothing happens there that affects these numbers, if we keep having significant value growth above and beyond what we were thinking in the initial bond discussions that we had last summer, we could potentially even have a decrease in our rate, depending on how this strategy works out. So, I mean, that's, you know, that's, my plan is to, if we can make that happen, great, but we want to put ourselves in a position, you know, certainly so that we can potentially absorb phase 2 of any potential bond program under the current rate. But if we're able to do it in such a way where we even have a decrease, you know, all the better. So that's what we're thinking.
And follow-up question I have is, and that sounds interesting. Somebody is willing to pay a 2% premium to get a short-term bond, which I haven't seen much. Maybe it's a new phenomenon. So question is, which other school district of our size or even larger is utilizing this kind of opportunity? Or
It's not in the presentation tonight, but I think it was in the memo to the superintendent. There's probably not fewer now than 40 school districts that are doing this, including a lot of districts your size. When we started this program, in Texas at least, in 2001, there was one school district. So school districts have clearly seen that there's an advantage to having their portfolio of debt be other than fixed rate only, which is what we've had in Texas for a long, long time. The other thing I want to remind the board about is everyone is expecting Fed action, which impacts the short end of the yield curve, which is what we're talking about here. But if you've seen from a historical perspective how the Fed has addressed what they call normalizing rates, they do it in a very nice stair-step effect. And the reason it's designed that way is because they don't want to shock the market. In instances where they're going the other way around, where they're trying to stay ahead of deflation and other negative things that could occur in the market, then you'll see dramatic drops in the Fed funds rate, as we last saw after 08-09. So my point there is that we will see, at some distance, we will see what's happening with the short end of the yield curve, and with these 1 and 2 year options here, we'll be able to react fairly quickly. The other thing that we've always done as a sort of an interest rate mitigation tool is we amortize these short-term financings. Other entities, not school districts, other entities, typically when they do a variable rate financing, they don't amortize any principal. And so by doing this, by amortizing principal, that's another way to mitigate interest rate risk. Because if interest rates even were to go up the slightest amount, you're measuring that against a reduced principal amount in an attempt to maybe keep debt service payments flat. Right.
And also I like the idea Steve mentioned, staggering it, you know, the maturity staggering, which gives us a little more protection in that area. Thank you.
So just to finish up on this schedule, what the target here, and as you can see from the far right-hand side of the page here, is that we're maintaining the INS tax rate at 30 cents. The change column basically shows you the change from the previous fiscal year to that fiscal year, and so we think we're well on track to keeping that tax rate at that 30-cent level.
All right, and then just also to add, all of our neighboring districts, Alvin, Lamar, Katy, Cy-Fair, you know, all of them, Houston, all of them have done the variable rate soft puts.
This next page just shows you a very quick schedule of activities over the next few weeks. I do want to point out to the board that we've got on here, third item from the bottom, pricing. We are looking at moving that pricing schedule down possibly 2 weeks. However, we're going to maintain the closing date, so you're not impacted by funds deposited in the bank, and you can begin to start paying construction invoices. And Steve, I think that was it for me.
Yeah, I think so. So, you know, we are going to, we have the.
Yeah,
Mr.
sorry.
Rice has a question.
I was just going to ask, what is the time frame that we have to spend the funds once we sell the bonds before we're penalized? Is it 2 years
No, sir. It's, I think we have 5 years
to spend?
before the IRS starts asking questions. Now,
Okay.
you know, we're well over that in our 2007 funds. And so, I've been anxious to close out as many of our funds, older funds, as possible, and I think we'll be finished closing out the 2003s even. If you have mitigating circumstances, if you can tell a story as to why things have been delayed and whatever else, the economic downturn, other things like that, there are, you have those circumstances. The thing saving us in this case is the fact that, we have negative arbitrage with these unspent funds. And so we're not in a situation where we issued monies and then we had it in the bank making 5%, but you're only spending it at a lower amount. And so those are mitigating factors, thankfully. But it really is in our best interest to close out all those funds as quickly as possible.
Okay, so 5 years is the threshold, and then the sale of the $100 million is based on the taxable valuation increase in next year, 2016, of 12%, 5% in 2017, 3% in 18 through 2022, and 0% thereafter. So that's a pretty conservative outlook.
Right, and that's also, again, the $100 million isn't necessarily based on those rates. I mean, those rates below are affect taxes over on the right. I mean, the $100 million is what we're looking at with regard to our cash flows, and we don't want to issue debt, too early. But again, we're also thinking about, what the state might do, and we think, $100 million is a good number to have. We want to have all of that issued and on the books before September 1st. Given what the state may do. So that's how we ended up deciding that.
Thank you.
Mr. Bassett, did you talk about last month about some other short-term borrowing scheme that, but scheme is the wrong word, sorry.
Tool, how about tool, instrument.
Sorry. Obviously, I'm not in finance, I'm in engineering.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, okay, and your reason for not recommending that at this point is because we want to issue the full amount before September 1st or in the short term.
Right.
You could explain that.
Well, we know
please.
for sure we need some funds, and so $100 million is a number that helps us from a cash flow perspective. What the and Ro will jump in here because at some point, but the commercial paper is something that you set up and you have at your disposal, so that if you're thinking about going into the market to issue debt like this, if the market turns, maybe you're in a situation where if you really need to have the money, you can issue something just quickly that'll only be outstanding for 30 or 60 days, as opposed to something that'll be there for a year or 2 years, which is what we're proposing here. And so the commercial paper program is a concept that we will, I anticipate us bringing to the board later this calendar year, is something that can give us the tools so that whenever we're thinking about our issuance in the spring, next spring, we can be thinking about the timing and be a little bit more precise, potentially.
Okay, so it's something that we'll probably see again in the future, but
yes.
we're not using that this summer. We're just going quickly to this.
Right. We don't anticipate we don't need that this summer. I mean, we feel pretty good about the cash flows that are in place right now, and but I did definitely see that as an instrument we would use in the future to help decrease our borrowing costs.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions for Mr. Bassett? All right, keep going then.
Okay,
We're
so
almost to slide 30,
my last slide.
I don't know what
My last slide, well, it's not my last slide, I got the critical dates, but kind of my slide of uncertainty. We have our uncertainty with our local value growth. The legislative session obviously still in play. I mean, if they don't decide to do something this month, if there's a standoff over the tax relief, okay, they could decide to go into a special session. And if that happens, I mean, it's not going to affect our cash flows. I mean, we'll be okay. I could just see us bringing forth an amendment after the beginning of the fiscal year. I think we're going to be fine. And so that certainly could happen. But if they don't adopt a budget, they will have to do a special session with a time frame of that, probably starting in July, and then that'll go for a couple months. I don't think that'll happen, but it's just out there. Again, the school finance lawsuit, we'll have to see what happens with that. I was worried about, new campus expenses if we're opening things that aren't completely utilized. Transportation, I mean, what else can I say about that? And then one of the things I just want to be reminding the board is that, we have a significant technology plan to the tune of, 70 million, that was put forth. But, only, less than 40 of that was funded in the bond. And so we're going to continue to find ways to piece together to fund the rest of that. And so if we do get some significant one-time money in this, from this legislative session, we may be asking to put some of that toward that, since it'd be general fund money and not monies that we would be borrowing. So our dates, we have the workshop now. We're going to ask you for approval on the compensation recommendations, and then also the action to call the meeting, and then we'll have the special meeting in June. That'll be the public meeting to discuss the budget, and then we'll be asking you to adopt the budget in June. The last note I had with regard, I forgot to say it, with regard to the bond parameter order. The bond parameter order would be, we're asking that the board approve that in next week, to give us, maximum flexibility. The most we'd be able to issue would be $100 million. Again, we've told you our plan is to do two variable rate put bonds, one for 1 year, 50 for 1 year, 50 for another year. But if the market's very different, we want to have some flexibility so that if we do need to go fixed rate, we can. Or if we need to do a combination of the two, we can. And so the parameter orders were written in such a way to give us maximum flexibility, but to the extent that we would only be issuing $100 million sometime in the next 2 months.
Thank you, Mr. Bassett. That was very informative. Do we have any questions for any of them? We've asked all our questions. All right. Thank you very much.
We've also included, as another information item, the quarterly financial update that as of March 31st. So it's presented to you in the agenda for your review, and so we don't have a presentation on that, but we certainly wanted to respond to any questions you might have in having reviewed the agenda for this evening. And of course, even if you look at it later, you can let us know if you have other questions on that.
Is that on our desks?
It's in the book. It's actually in the board book.
Do we have any questions about that? Mrs. Hassan is looking like she has a question. All right, so there. Great, you answered you answered them already.
If you think of something later, just send me a note.
All right, very well. So next we're ready to move on to the internal audit committee update. Thank you, Mr. Bassett, for your reports.
Thank you, Madam President. And to the board, we have a report on a status report and an informational item for your consideration. You may recall that in January of 2014, the board did take action to eliminate the position of the internal auditor. But subsequent to that, in May of last year, we reversed that position and reinstated a reconstituted position of the internal auditor. And we did work with the administration to craft our local policy to reflect that, which essentially was to have an internal auditor working with outside consultants to effectively outsource the auditing functions. But during this past year, the Human Resources group led by Mr. Spears has been searching for a suitable internal auditor for us to interview. And just over the period of last year and our experience with managing the audit function, we came to realize that it's really more than the audit committee as volunteers can manage. And you may recall in March we asked approval of the board, which was granted to hire Cheyenne Rolfe and use her as a program manager on an interim basis until such time that HR could come up with a suitable internal auditor candidate for our review. And so while the interim program manager has been helpful, still after a year's worth of experience working with Gibson on this, it's the opinion of the audit committee that we do in fact need to hire an internal auditor. This process we plan to continue to be primarily outsourced to firms such as Gibson Consulting, not solely them, but firms like them. And the audit committee, which is appointed yearly by the board president, believes that this will provide stability for both the audit process and the audit committee for over the years to come. So as we conclude this fiscal year and look to the future, there are many remaining audits planned for the next 2 to 3 years, including human resources and security and monitoring on deck. In addition to that, technology, transportation, risk management, special ed, facilities and operations, and furniture, fixtures, and equipment are also slated for an audit in the years to come. I would like to add that the audit committee anticipates sharing the administration's timeline to implement best practices described in the SIS audit. We anticipate getting that timeline response from the administration over the next 2 weeks, and we would share that with the board at that time. I'll be happy to answer any questions anyone may have.
I would just to add to that, we also currently have a payroll audit that's ongoing right now, and that I think is concluding in the summer, so we'd be hearing back about that. And maybe, Dr. Dupree, could you tell us are we coming up with the task timelines? Are those coming soon to us? Would we expect those this week?
I don't know if you'll have them this week. I've not seen them yet, but I know staff has been working on them, and I'll give them a good review before we share them with the board. So likely within the next couple of weeks.
Okay, so when would the board expect the SIS follow-up audit to be distributed to them? Because it's only been to the audit committee, it hasn't been to the full board. We were going to send it out with the timeline.
Yes, I would say probably by next Friday, not the 15th, but whatever the next Friday is.
22nd.
22nd.
That's really handy then. Over Memorial Day weekend, we'll have some extra
Lots of reading. Lay by the pool and read.
Okay. Great. Do we have any other questions for the audit committee? All right, then we're ready to, our next item is to convene in closed session under the Texas Open Meetings Act for the purpose of private consultation with the board's attorney and for several personnel matters. The board is now convened in closed session.